another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. We are working constantly and searching and researching and wanting to bring to you all of the latest, most pertinent information in regards to your health and living, and maybe bring to your attention some things you may or may not be aware of, or maybe have heard something about but have not quite sure about it. This is one of probably the most important broadcasts that I'll do, because we're talking about something that sets a whole life of a person unless some things are done or interventions are made to alter it. And what we're talking about is the whole concept of pre- and perinatal birth trauma, along with the early period of time leading up to psychological birth. Now, I'll mention at the beginning that in my estimation there's a certain group of things that are important to know. One is that the infant or the fetus in pregnancy is a product of the genetics that are passed on to begin with. Half being from the father and half from the mother. So those are a set of influences. And when I say influences, it used to be thought that the genetics set everything from behavior to eye color, you name it. Everything that has to do with you is all set by the genes. Now, that was the original theory. And there was a lot of talk about once we break or crack the genetic code of the human, called the human genome, we're going to know all this stuff about what's going on, what the pre-influence is, and they didn't say pre-influence, they said what you were set. In other words, if you had a gene for a certain thing, then that's set, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so they were hoping that with the genetic work they could come up with a gene for everything. And of course, I'm sure that you hear on the news periodically about, well, they've discovered the fat gene, and they've discovered the schizophrenic gene, and they've discovered this gene, and they've discovered that gene. Now, what that really means is that some researcher has been digging and playing around with some data, and they think that they may have isolated. But when it hits the news, it's not just they may have. Well, they found the fat gene, or they found this or that. One of the people we're going to be talking about in this broadcast, interestingly, he mentioned that there was a period of time that about every 2 or 3 months there was somebody on the news saying they had isolated the gene for schizophrenia. But of course it was a different gene than the one that had been announced 2 or 3 months before. So anyhow, they were playing around with it, and researchers were doing a lot to get attention. And you have to understand the realm of research. When one sets out to be a researcher, they intend to earn their living doing research. And so that means that they have to come up with catchy things to sell the people who are putting out the money for research on putting money in what they're looking at, and they have to convince them that you're going to come up with some significant information out of that research. And so it's important for them to make the public think, and the investors in research, that what they're doing is important enough to get a chunk of the money that they have available to pass out. So what they do is they drop these tidbits or carrots on a stick and make everybody think, wow, they've really uncovered something or are about to uncover something. And then everybody says, well, gee, we better put some more money in, because they may come up with something very significant. And of course, if you look back over the years at all the times you've been told that, and then you look at the outcome, how many people have really come up with something significant that's made any major change in health and well-being, and you will see that basically, like many other schemes out there, that the research field can be a scheme. a way of drawing in a lot of money and producing very little in the end. But in the meantime, they had a good living doing the project. So I'm saying that they thought that genes controlled everything. In fact, we've talked about it before. The genetics they were talking about way back in the turn of the century and into the early part of the 20th century, like the 19th and 20th century, about eugenics, about how everything is determined by inheritance or genes, and there's nothing you can do about it, and therefore if somebody has come from a family with bad genes, then they should either be sterilized that they can't pass it on, or they should be just eradicated, period. The Nazis were very good at that in World War II, convincing people that all the people who had mental problems or serious health problems, the most humane thing they could do was just exterminate them, and therefore would put them out of their misery. So anyhow, it got so bad that even in this country we had thousands of forced sterilizations, and even Harvard got in the picture producing a degree program in eugenics, which was getting rid of defective genetic lines. And there was a lot of research done in this country in that area. So anyhow, it was always thought that the genes were the absolute controllers. And when Watson and Crick finally came up with the structure of DNA, they thought it all had been solved, and that was in the 50s. And so from then on, there's been all this talk, well, if we just know what all the genes are and what they do, then we can come up with therapies where we can insert new genes, or we can deactivate genes, and therefore we can control everything. It sounded great. However, when we got to the Genome Project, which I'm sure you heard about for a long time, because there was a lot of talk, well, we have all this research going, we're mapping all the human genome, and we're going to know all the genes, and therefore we're going to come out with these amazing therapies where we can actually go in and change the genetic. And I mentioned before that it didn't end up that way. You know, they knew that there's at least 100,000 proteins in the body, and they knew that there's probably another 25,000 genes needed to code for controllers and so forth, or regulators. And so they estimated that they were going to find about 125,000 genes in the human genome. But interestingly, when they finally completed the project, all of a sudden everything got pretty quiet about genetics, and it still is. You don't hear nearly as much of all this big talk about how we can do all this genetic manipulation, and we can make perfect people by taking out bad genes, putting in good genes, and pretty soon we're creating perfect humans. I mean, that's what it sounded like, the way it was presented. However, at the end of the Genome Project, when they finally finished it, instead of finding 125,000 genes, they only found about 25 to 30,000, somewhere in that range, that it appears are really the genes that code for human beings. Now, that means there wasn't even enough genes to code for 100,000 proteins, which your body needs to grow and repair itself and carry on all the processes that it carries on. So that immediately meant, uh-oh, something is wrong, we don't understand. As they looked into it further, they found out that there were all kinds of things that happened, like jumping genes. The body would actually relocate genes from one location to another. They would activate and inactivate genes. That one gene could be triggered by some signal in the body, which could activate another 2 or 3 genes, which in turn would activate another 2 or 3 genes, and out of that library, it would put together the final combination that would make an expression. So that meant, where do you intervene in a 3-step process to be able to make corrections? And of course, it's not possible because we don't know what direction it's going to go. And so it ended up that the genetic thing, and after millions or maybe billions of dollars were put into research, kind of has come to a dead end in my mind as far as what they're going to be able to do. Because now they have to figure what are the signals that turn on the original gene, which then turns on the other genes, which then turns on the other genes, which finally get expressed, and what shuts down genes. And so when we were talking a little bit about cancer, we mentioned in the anti-aging about the immortality thing, that there's a gene that codes for an enzyme called telomerase, which means it allows the cell to keep replicating over and over and over, or in essence become immortal, which is what cancer does. So now how do you access that gene and how do you make it work in people where it's normally capped off, which I would say we have the gene, but it's capped off. And so there's all this research how to activate that and make it work. And as of yet, of course, that hasn't been solved. So I'm saying all that to say that even the genetic influence is not as solid and really understood as it used to be. And now there's something called transposons that you'll find really interesting. We don't have time to talk about it, but we will at some later point when we're talking more about genetics. So we find that the genetic, at least is an influence. It has the potential to cause you to develop in certain ways and so forth. But when it gets down to behavior, the psychiatrists for a long time have been trying to make all the processes that are problems in the body either genetic and or biochemic so that they can give you drugs to control it. Now, when I say the psychiatrists, actually behind that are the pharmaceutical people who are making these drugs and making a killing off of them and doing killing in the process, meaning I believe, in my opinion, that the evidence is very strong how much damage is being done to people's brains and nervous systems by the psychoactive drugs that are being spread out. And we talked a little bit about psychiatry, what's happened with it, how it went from behavioral, such as emotional and mental disorders, to biochemic disturbances that need to be regulated by drugs. And of course it became easier, it became more profitable, and ultimately, as I hate to say, behind almost everything today, there is a money motive, even if it appears that it's benevolent in nature, but when you get to the background, you find that there's some profit issue involved out of whatever's being promoted to supposedly help you. So on top of it, the genetics not being what we thought they were, now a whole new realm has arisen, which is epigenetics. And epigenetics are factors that come down through the family that's inherited but are not in the genes. But interestingly, they seemingly in some way regulate how genes express. Now, I mentioned before that in homeopathic medicine, it's been known since way back in the 1800s that we bring in with us some pre-influence, which they called a miasm, which literally meant an inherited taint. And so that influences the outcome of a person both behaviorally and physically. So epigenetics is something new that's popped up now. A lot of research on it. I've mentioned a book before on it by Dawson Church, who's a PhD researcher, called The Genie and the Genes. If you want to find out a little bit more about epigenetics, and recently there's another book been released on epigenetics. I don't even recall it now because I have it, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But that's some of the latest stuff that's being found in epigenetics. So those have an influence on a new life. Also, then we have the intrauterine life, what's going on inside the uterus and with the mother while the child is intrauterine. And for some reason, people have gotten this idea that the fetus is totally separated and that no matter what the mother does, has no influence on the fetus, which is totally untrue. And that's what a new realm of investigation has come up called pre- and perinatal trauma. And sometimes it's just referred to as influences, but it can be traumatic. And so what goes on with the mother, in fact, does have a tremendous influence, not only nutritionally for the physical body, but emotionally for the emotions and the psyche of the infant. All those things influence. It's been found that the child starts hearing very early in the developmental process. The brain and nervous system are one of the first things that begin to form early in the development of the fetus. And so they're very strongly influenced by the moods, by the trauma to the mother, by emotional outbursts or injury to the mother, or to the mother's own attitude, whether she's depressed, whether she's happy, what the environment is, what's going on around her, how loud the noise is, what type of noise it is, all of these things. There's been a lot of studies that the fetus is hearing very early and that it can make a difference in the development and the mental health of a fetus. And then we have the birth process itself, which is can be very traumatic. And we're probably going to talk about a therapist by the name of Janoff, who wrote a book called The Primal Scream, who developed a type of therapy to help people release trauma related to the birth experience. And so he has done, I would say, some very good work and has had some very good results. And I remember when that first came on the scene many years ago, the concept of primal therapy. And a lot of people went and trained with him and opened centers around. But it was a very loud therapy because it's called the primal scream, and the idea was to go back and connect with the pain of the birth experience and release that from your tissue. Now, I'm saying that to say the tissue does record, your body physically records trauma, both physical trauma and emotional trauma. And that has an influence on your later development and health. And if it's very traumatic, it can be a big problem. And there's a lot of studies on that, and one of the people we'll talk a little bit more about is Dr. Wilhelm Reich. He was a psychiatrist protege of Freud, and he understood the physical connection with emotional issues and how it could alter your health, even to the point of generating cancer. In fact, one of his books he wrote was called The Cancer Biopathy, and it would be good for you to look into a lot of Reich stuff. One of his books called Character Analysis was a standard text for psychiatry for years. I think they've now laid it aside because there's other stuff that's come out since then, but that was a standard text. He wrote a lot of books, and the books that he wrote all had to do with how all these influences influence us and our physical body. Not only the psyche, but it gets in the body. In fact, he had a theory that, but it was more than a theory because he demonstrated it worked, that once you have some type of bad problem, that part of your defense is that a portion of your body gets involved in that defense, which he called armoring, which was something quite unique with him. You know, Freud tried to talk everybody out of everything, which was only somewhat effective, but in many cases had no effect. And so Reich took it a step farther and says the body's involved in the process of the defenses that you generate to protect yourself, and therefore that part of the body becomes tense and tight, which he calls an armoring, or a layer of armor, and it helps protect you from what you consider to be attacks or assaults from outside. And so that his work became very important in understanding the body-mind, and when we get to the therapeutic side of this a little bit, we'll talk more about Reich and some of the people who studied with him who have carried on the work. But anyhow, it's very physical, and people don't give it a thought how much trauma there is to it. And one of the people we're going to be talking quite a bit about is a doctor out of France by the name of Le Boyer, and he wrote a book called Birth Without Violence. And to read that book is an experience in itself. I think you need to do yourself a tremendous favor and read through the book if you want to understand what goes on with the infant or the newborn in the process of birth. And so he developed a whole new way of birthing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And we also are carrying this through to the birth of the psychological side of a person. Now everybody realizes that at the physical birth, that is the physical birth. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the infant is still psychologically connected to the mother, and it's not till about age 3 that separation or birth occurs. And so it's during that period of time that I'm concerned with what we're talking about here, is the time from conception through birth and through the first 3 years of life. And it's that period of time, which is approximately 4 years, that all the things are formed psychologically and pretty much physically is set. Now, if the mother had terrible nutrition, and the baby did not get good nutrients, bad things can happen. I think most people know about the folic acid and the neural tube defect, If you want to have something like spina bifida, an open spine that never closes properly in the developmental process, then don't have enough folic acid. That will cause that to happen. So there are certain deficiency factors that, if they're not present, is going to make a huge effect on the physical birth and the physical health of a fetus and later infant. So those, to me, it's that whole period of time from the conception to age 3, completing both the physical birth and the psychological birth, that really sets what's going to happen to us for the rest of our life, unless we do some intervention and we understand. Now, if you come from a healthy mother who has a good, pleasant life during the time of carrying the fetus, the birth goes real smooth, and the mother is a kind, loving mother and understands what's going on and gives the young infant the room to develop and to go through the psychological birth, then they don't have all those problems. But unfortunately, the way our society has gone is very contrary. And now we've got a tremendous amount of problems going on just because of the fact that they don't understand how much influence that those first few years have on the life, especially emotional life of a child. And we're going to talk about some of those areas and from some of the people we've just been talking about. Okay, so we know that it's not understood very well by the average person, nor is it very much talked about. People don't say a whole lot about it. They just assume, well, you get pregnant, you carry the baby, and it's born, and it grows up, and blah, blah, blah. So we don't get it really into the whole process very much. And it's, I think, worse now than before, because there was a period of time when I was young that the average mother did not work. She had children, and she was a mother, and she stayed home and took care of them. But then as World War II came along, there was a big problem. The men were off to war. Somebody had to work in the factories to produce the arms and the planes and all the weaponry that was used in the war. So women started going out and working in the factories. Once World War II ended, it never settled back down. And as I say, I lived through that process. I remember seeing it happen, that now the women that went out and worked, so many of them were not content to come back into the home and be a mother. They enjoyed being able to get out. They enjoyed making money. And so everybody assumed over a period of time that that's the way it is, that men and women both work and they pool their money, and they can have a lot more, because then it got into the big thing that everybody needs to be competitive with everybody else who's got the bigger boat, the bigger car, the bigger house, and can go on the best vacations and blah, blah, blah. So that took a lot of money. But something had to suffer in the process, and the suffering is, interestingly, that people still wanted to have the children, but they didn't want the children to interfere with their life. And so then we had the advent of the nursery schools, and we have all this other stuff that came up, and some kids didn't want to go to nursery school, especially at a very young age. It represented a separation. And that separation occurs during this first 3 years of life, and that's when big problems can accrue from that. And so that's what we're talking about, and especially Dr. Clancy McKenzie, who is a psychiatrist who has studied this for years and years and years, has come up with some very interesting material, and it's proven to be very accurate. He literally did studies of thousands of patients, and they were able to tie this all together to the point that he can make predictions as to when a trauma occurred and the nature of the trauma just by the way that the person's now behaving with their emotional problems. And so I think you'll find this all very interesting. I don't know that we're going to get through this whole program in one session, so it may well take two, but we'll see where we're going with it. So that kind of gives you an introduction of what we're all talking about now, that we're on the same street, so to speak, that we're talking about this certain period of time, which is pushing 4 years, in the conception and birth of and development of a child through that psychological birth. Now, I studied with a psychiatrist in Cleveland by the name of Dr. Irving Rosen. I've mentioned him before. He had a theory about schizophrenia, and that it had to do with the psychological birth in the mother. So it was a mother-child problem, and he pretty well has proven that, and you're going to see that Mackenzie has done a tremendous amount showing that what can happen in that period of time. It doesn't have to be just with the mother. There's other factors that can be there. Dr. Rosen was pretty solid on it. It was all the mother. Doesn't have to be, but the mother's behavior can be a big factor. But other events, I mean, the mother can die. There's other things that can happen, and in the process that can end up becoming a problem for a very young child before age 3. Because, as I say, that's a very critical period up through age 3. After that, then the ability of the child to deal with the new traumas that come along is much better, but it's the scary part up through age 3 that creates the big problems. Now, Dr. Mackenzie referred to that as delayed post-traumatic stress syndrome that was later in life triggered by a similar event which precipitated becoming schizophrenic or becoming a severe depressive, which would include, of course, manic depressive type behavior. And so he was able to document that and develop ways of helping people get out of that. So we'll talk a little bit more about his work, and maybe it will kind of ring a bell with you, or it will connect, and you'll say, oh, that sounds right. Now, the other thing that I want to mention real fast is that it's the thing about modern medicine. I don't know how many times I hear the comment, well, modern medicine has found a way to improve on nature, or we hear the scientific community has found a way to improve on nature. And I don't know about you, but over the years I've found that every time that they've said and done that, that down the road some bigger problem has accrued from this improvement that they made this change for. If you just use a little bit of logic and you think, how long has nature been around? For millions of years, and has actually brought things into a certain state of balance. Now, if we intervene in that and we somehow change that, we don't just change that single event, we change how that event is part of a bigger picture. And that means that we disrupt the whole chain of things that occur after that. And the same is in your body. If you have something that disrupts a single biochemical step in the body, then all of those biochemical steps that follow that are disrupted. And so it's even in modern medical therapy, if you take a drug that shuts down a particular process so that you can relieve a symptom so the person can feel better, what have you done? Well, it's true that they're not feeling that symptom because you've intervened and you've turned it off by using a drug, but all of those other processes that follow that step now are also disrupted. So down the road, you can end up with a much more serious, deeper, and sometimes very difficult to correct, if not impossible, condition, because you think that feeling better didn't make any difference. You can just jump in and make you feel better and don't worry about the consequences. So whether it's in brain chemistry with the psychoactive drugs, which I think are very, very bad because a lot of them end up that they can create a permanent disabled person from the psychoactive drug. They can damage the neurology so bad with the drugs that they, down the road, will never recover. And I've read many cases of it. One recently just of a young teenager that was put on antidepressants at a very young age. And then, so many times when you put somebody on a drug, it creates other effects. So then they give other drugs to offset those effects. And pretty soon they've got a lot of medication going on that's totally disrupting the normal function of the body. And so this case, the girl is 13 or 14. She's totally disabled because of the drugs. whatever depression issues that she had before that could have been worked out now makes no difference, because now she permanently has no control of her body via her brain nervous system, because she developed a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which means you lose control of the muscles. You can't control them anymore. And so she has to be helped at everything she does. And here's a 14-year-old girl, totally disabled, not because of her problem, but because of the treatment of the problem. Now those are referred to as iatrogenic illnesses, which means caused by the treatment. And we haven't talked real heavily yet on nosocomial problems and iatrogenic problems. But those are problems created either by the hospital or by the treatment. And mostly those are masked. And we are going to do more of a session on that type of thing and maybe point out how bad the problem is. But we got to bring together a lot of numbers to do that, and a lot of sources. And see, I know it because I deal with it all the time. I see the problems when people come into my office that have been created not by their problem, but by the treatment they received for the problem, because of this obsession, what I call an obsession of managing symptoms. In other words, we must be comfortable every minute of every day, and so we do drugs to take care of it. Now, I don't know how many of you have read a book by Huxley that was written years ago, Aldous Huxley, called Brave New World. But it's an interesting book, and when you look at what he wrote years and years ago, I mean, we're talking 40, maybe 40 years ago, or later, 50 years ago maybe. He made a prediction in this book, which is like a story, but it's a prediction of where he saw society going. And they even made a movie of it. If you can find the movie, it would be good to watch it, because it will give you some insight. You know, when we're living in the middle of things, we don't necessarily notice the way that they're going, or the trends, or the implications of what's going on, where it's leading us. But if you can step back aside and look at the big picture, you can begin to see where we were here and now where we are here, and realize how these things interfered or changed the outcome of where we've gotten to. But because we're born in the middle of it and we grow up in it, we don't even notice it. It's like we're kind of blind to it. But when you read his book, it gives you a view of stepping back and seeing what can happen. Now, without going into all the details, the bottom line was that because people had no choice in this society that he proposed was coming, and as much as they had no choice of what they were going to do with their life, it was all preset for them by the government controllers. They were afraid that they might revolt. And so in order to keep them from revolting, the best thing to do was to furnish them free mood-elevating drugs to take. So everybody got free supplies of these drugs. So whether they're like LSD or they're amphetamines, whatever they are, to put you in an upscale mood and keep you from thinking about your plight. Then they could keep control of the people, and there was no rebellion of the fact that, okay, the government has said I'm going to be a plumber, and no matter what I think or want, it makes no difference, I'm going to be a plumber, because that was my assignment for my spot in society. And so you'll see what happens if you read the book and or watch the movie. I think it's a very good eye-opener to show you where it can get. And you know, if you read all the different things he talks about, you'll see that we're almost there totally. We're just on the verge of being exactly where he predicted years and years ago. There was another book written by Orwell years ago too that did similar predictions, but I think Huxley probably hit it on the head very close, because if you're ultimately going to be a part of a world government, which is very strong now, that movement to be into a whole world government, then it's going to be important to do two things: reduce population and assign everybody a task that they have to perform. So the idea of choosing a profession will not be part of the process. It will be pre-chosen for you, and you will need to accept that. And so using psychoactive drugs is a good way to keep people from thinking too much or worrying too much about it. If you keep them in an upper mood all the time, then it's not important to them. They kind of don't bother thinking about it. And so we're seeing this, that these psychoactive drugs are extremely difficult in terms of what they do to you and what they cause when they shut things down. So anyhow, so much for modern medicine improving on nature. It just doesn't work that way. And if we look at our world in general, where they've intervened with nature, right here in Florida, they changed the course of a river down south of Orlando many years ago, and now there's big talk, and I don't know if they did yet, of changing it back because it created another whole new set of problems, because over thousands of years or millions of years, the river cut its own direction that worked the best for everything, and everything around it was all adjusted to it being that way. And then you come along and change the course of the river, you upset everything that was dependent on it being a certain way. And people, for some reason, they only look at the immediate thing. They don't look at the bigger picture and all the implications when something happens. And so getting into our model here, we've got medicine has come along and made the birthing process a disease. Pregnancy and the birth process is a disease. And in the process of doing that, what they've done is they have made it into a business. So now it's become a routine of a series of processes that every pregnant mother goes through who goes to her doctor for that process. They get to do all the testing, they get to do the ultrasounds, they get to do any other amniocentesis or whatever. Well, we want to know something about the genetics, so they stick a large needle into the placental sac and withdraw amniotic fluid and run a testing on it. And so all this stuff is going on, and each procedure brings in a pile of money. And by the time the mother's gone through the whole process, the medical profession has extracted a large sum of money for this whole process, but they treat it like a disease. I mean, from the time you're pregnant until you have your child, you're almost made to feel you're sick. And that you have to keep seeing the doctor, and he has to keep doing all these tests, and he has to keep checking all this. And of course, everything he checks in every procedure brings in more money, so it becomes quite expensive. And of course, one of the procedures which I think is detrimental to the fetus is the intrauterine or the uterine ultrasound. I mean, they've got people real excited. Well, you can know whether you're going to have a boy or a girl, which it doesn't always come out right anyhow, because sometimes it's wrong. But anyhow, you get to know whether you're going to have a boy or a girl and blah, blah, blah. But if you understand what ultrasound is a very high energy, high frequency electromagnetic wave. And when you shoot it into the tissue, it was originally developed to heat the tissue inside for people with pain and arthritic problems and injuries and so forth, so that extreme vibration of the ultrasound causes the molecules to vibrate at extremely high speeds, and when that happens, it produces heat. A microwave does the same thing. In your microwave oven, you have a very high energy, high frequency sound wave that vibrates the water molecules in the food so fast that they produce heat and makes it very hot. And so when you're doing a scan, I don't care how low energy it is, it's still going to produce a certain level of heat. And people who have done ultrasound scans notice that the fetus tends to react to it. And I wonder why. Here's a tiny little body that's being shot with a very high energy vibrational sound wave. It's going to do things to it. Now, I have known of several cases where in a day or so after the ultrasound that they miscarried. And that's not to say maybe there weren't some problems, but I think it exacerbated and probably, and maybe in some cases, brought the whole thing on by itself doing the ultrasound. I've known in many cases the next day the lady would miscarry after it. I've had patients that's happened to, and I've known some doctors that their wives, same thing happened. They went in for ultrasound, the next day they had a miscarriage. I think it's bad for the child. If you can imagine the brain of the fetus being vibrated at thousands of vibrations per second, producing heat, that's going to be beneficial to that fetus. It may be a novelty to be able to see it on the screen and say, and look at it, but who cares about what's happening to the fetus? And I'm saying that because of this whole process is we all look at it from our viewpoint and not from the viewpoint of the fetus. Now, when you get to reading some of this material, and the one that you must read is Dr. Laboyer's Birth Without Violence. His book puts you into touch with what's going on with the fetus and why, after it's born, the infant goes through some of the things it goes through, and how you can change that whole thing by the way you do the birthing. Now, we all really understand that the way the birthing process is done today by modern medicine, it's done for the welfare of the fetus and the mother, right? Wrong. It is done for the convenience of the doctor. The positioning for the birth is done for the convenience of the doctor. Doing all those procedures that they do during the process. When the baby is finally born, turning it upside down and slapping it and forcing it to start breathing right away is wrong. I mean, when you read Laboyer, you're going to have a total different viewpoint about birth. And that's why he calls it birth without violence, because he allows the infant to follow the natural processes that an infant would follow. So they don't come out and start screaming and crying, and they don't have all the trauma that is introduced to them at the birth process. That is, I say, convenient for the doctor, not for the mother and the fetus. And for speed, you know. And there's been a big study on cesarean sections, and we may be able to get to that, not today, but probably in this whole process we can get to talk a little bit about what a cesarean section does, because it changes a lot of things about the fetus and the infant by doing a cesarean section. And I'm not saying that there could not be some severe circumstances where it's necessary, but of course, like everything else, it's either overdone, done for the convenience of the doctor, and or for profit. And the reason I say that, I know an attorney who went to a major hospital in Georgia, and somehow he got into the idea about this whole thing of cesarean section. Now, you know, insurance-wise, a doctor gets paid a lot more money for a cesarean section than they do for a standard birth. So, anyhow, this attorney got access to the records, and he found that if a person came into the hospital who was poor and was either having to pay their way or had very poor insurance, they went through the natural birth process. If they had insurance that covered the cesarean section, or they had a lot of money that they could afford it, either way. He found that the ones who could afford it, about 70% of those mothers ended up with cesarean section, where only about 3 or 4% of the mothers who did not have the money to pay for the cesarean section ended up with a natural birth. Now, theoretically, the only reason to do a cesarean section if there's some bad complication that would make it a problem to go through the natural birth process. And that's the only time it normally would be required. But now here's 70% of the people who have insurance or money to pay for it end up with a cesarean section. Now, you're going to tell me that well-off people have more complications that require cesarean than the poor people do. The problem with being around this world a long time is you get to see a lot of things, and you get to see patterns develop, and you get to see information and so forth that you don't see in a short period of time. And so whenever you are injected into this world and you don't get an opportunity to see the big picture, you just kind of assume that the way things are the way things are, and you don't give it any thought. There's only a few people who stop and step back and take a big look. And so, anyhow, there's been some special studies about the adverse effects of children who are born by cesarean section. And again, I'm saying that there can be a situation where it's required, and if that's the case, then you don't have a choice. But it does have a price to do that adds other problems to the life of that particular person that comes in by cesarean section. There's a big paper that's written, I have it, and of course we're not going to read it, called Suicide and Pre and Perinatal Psychotherapy. There's been a big study about how this experience of, we're just talking about, pre and perinatal influences can create problems that down the road can lead to suicide. And so this particular paper, there was a big study done on those relationships. I've kind of set the groundwork for what we're talking about to give you some idea, and I guess by now you know that I feel that it is a very important subject. And so we want to talk about, first of all, you should read the material that I'm talking about so you get some idea about the birthing process and some of these people who realize the problems and have spent a lot of time trying to do something with it. There's several things that I mentioned already that are influences in our life, and this birthing process is one. And so there are some doctors who have really gotten into it heavily. And we're going to be talking about at least 5 of those doctors that I think have done really significant things in understanding how this whole thing works and how to avoid a lot of problems on the front end. I already mentioned Le Boyer, and I think Le Boyer, in the birthing process itself, has probably moved farther ahead than anyone else as far as really understanding it. And as I say, in my mind, if you plan to have children or have never had any and at some point will be getting married and have children, I think you should read his book and really absorb it, because he does a tremendous job of giving you the feel of what's going on in that process and what happens when you have a non-traumatic birth because the doctor understands the process versus a normal birth process where a lot of things happen. Now, something else that came out of the Le Boyer method is they just did a study of people who were born by this Le Boyer process. And it appears that every child born using that process became ambidextrous. Now, I don't know all the implications, and I don't know if they know yet why. But it's interesting that under the normal birthing process, people come out either left-handed or right-handed. But under this birth without violence process, they come out ambidextrous. They can use either hand equally. I don't know what it is in the process that makes the difference or causes us to lateralize one side or the other. But for some reason, whatever that process is he uses, and of course he describes it, and he kind of draws you right into it. I have to say he's a very good writer, and he kind of draws you right into the whole birthing process step by step, and what each of the things mean, you know, why the child does cry or it doesn't cry. And of course some people think, well, if the child doesn't cry, then something must be wrong with it. But in this process, birth without violence, they normally won't cry. They don't need to. And the same thing of forcing the child to start breathing air before the a placenta is detached is bad because it actually is injurious to the lungs to start drawing air in before they're quite prepared for it. It needs to be a bit of a transition. So he talks about that, how you allow the baby, even after it's born, it's still attached to the umbilical cord, to the placenta. The placenta is not detached yet, and you can tell it because the cord is still pulsing. And so as long as that cord is pulsing, the infant is receiving oxygen via the mother's process. So they don't need to immediately start drawing in a bunch of air in the lungs. They don't need to be held upside down and slapped, as is done by regular medicine. They can be allowed to start their own breathing process gradually after they're born, and it lets them slowly acclimate until once they have taken over the breathing, then the pulsing of the cord stops, and that means now that the child is, or the infant is producing their own oxygen, and they don't need the placenta anymore. And once the pulsing stops, that's when the body begins the process of expelling the placenta. So there's no rush to cut the cord, and then there's no rush at all, that stuff. But it's much more convenient for the doctor to hurry up and get the child breathing and clip the umbilical cord and get it all over with as soon as they can, because that means that he can get to the next one faster and he doesn't get tied up. So as I say, once you read his book, Birth Without Violence, you are going to have a whole different feel about pregnancy and childbirth and so forth. And out of all of this, as I say, there's a group of therapists and psychiatrists who began to realize that there's a lot of trauma associated with the way birthing takes place and the things that can happen in the birthing process. And so that's why they formed this organization related to pre- and perinatal birthing. And they have an organization of therapists, and they've studied all of these problems. And out of that group is the paper I mentioned about earlier about suicide and the pre- and perinatal psychotherapy. And I've another article that some of the people that are heavily involved with the group, this one, The Baby Remembers Pain. And he cites a case where the child has a remembrance of being poked and all the things that go on at birth. Because everybody's under the assumption, and that's what Le Boyer dispels. They're under the assumption that the baby has no awareness, they don't feel anything, they don't know anything, they're just a blob. I mean, and that's the way it's looked at. It's like another barbaric procedure they do of circumcision, which in my mind is totally barbaric. There's no justification for it, even though every few years they come up with a different reason why it should be done. But the fact is, it's a big moneymaker for medicine, and so they use no analgesia of any kind, and the infant screams like crazy. But they say, well, it doesn't hurt. They don't feel anything. It's just they get scared because something's going on. But it's totally crazy, and it's a lie. They do feel. And yet it goes on and on and on, and huge amount of money is made every year doing circumcisions that don't need to be made. So it's like I say, you make a business out of every natural process like pregnancy and childbirth, make it into a business, and you come up with all the procedures that you can do that you can get paid for in the process. So you milk it for all the money that you can get out of it. And once you read Le Boyer, it's going to change your whole opinion of the whole thing. The child is not unaware. The child is very aware. The child maybe can't talk yet and use words, but they certainly are feeling and seeing and hearing and everything else. And anybody who's had a child realizes how fast they learn how they can manipulate you even to get what they want. So don't tell me they're not thinking. There's a lot going on in that early child, no matter what you may want to think. So we'll take it a step further, and we'll talk about one of the big players of the five that I talked about. Le Boyer was number one. The second one is a a doctor, psychiatrist by the name of Thomas Verney. And he has written some books. One, of course, has to do with, in fact, he wrote the very first one called The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And then later he wrote one on pre and perinatal psychology. And as a result of all the studies that they have done relating to this, he put out a book called Nurturing the Unborn Child. And that's going to, of course, be on our book list. And it's called a 9-month program for soothing, stimulating, and communicating with your baby. And if you read through it, you see that's what it is. For each month, based on where the fetus is developmentally, he has a participating program for the mother to do, or the mother and father, to actually have positive influences on the emotional, mental health, and ultimately physical health of the fetus and later the infant. And it's interesting because he knows and makes use of the fact as to when the child begins to hear, then you do certain things you can with music and sound. There's a lot of stuff out there, such as Mozart, baby Mozart, or playing Mozart music, and he gets into music and all that. So each month he's got a whole program that you do during the pregnancy to make it the healthiest possible for the fetus and for the infant after they're born. Now, he's not so big into that first 3 years like Mackenzie is, but his material is extremely good. So this, if you're going to have a child, this would be an extremely good book to read, but also his original book, which was on The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. So the 3 good ones would be The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, which was his first one. The second one was on pre and perinatal psychology, and then this one, which is on nurturing the unborn child. So this gentleman they've done tremendous studies on how these things affect the infant and their later life. And extremely good material, as far as I'm concerned, very good material. La Boyer, as I say, I've mentioned. The next big one that you heard me say just a minute ago that we want to talk about, Dr. Clancy Mackenzie wrote 2 books and a lot of papers and has become very recognized in his work. As I say, he did studies of thousands of people and has been able to verify, because they could tell him, okay, here's a person who's schizophrenic and here's their behavior. And he would say, well, at 1 year and 8 months, that child had this happen. And be right. Because when I read you a little bit, I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from him in a moment, but when you understand how he did this, you'll see that how accurate it is and how important his work is. Now, his 2 big books were, the first one, I think, this was the first one, called Delayed Post-Traumatic Stress Disorders from Infancy. And so this kind of laid the groundwork for some of the things that he's doing. And the second book, which is the more recent one, because he's been at this a long time now. The book, Babies Need Mothers, subtitled Mothers Can Prevent Mental Illness in Their Children, is his latest material that's a culmination of many, many years of being in the field. I mean, he's not new at it. He's been doing this for a long time. A lot of people never heard of him. He did a really thorough study and developed his own intuition, and we won't even have time to get into it today about how he did that, but at some point we'll probably talk about what really was one of the keys to helping him, I think, gain insight into the whole problem. But by his work, he was able to demonstrate very precisely when certain events occurred in a child's life. In this first, again, we're talking those first 3 years, it led to later problems. Now, what he said was that the first 2 years of life, if something happens in that period of time, and we won't go into it in too much detail, other than to say some event, such as if a child is the only child, or the first child, whichever, and another child is born, and that second child gets a lot of attention from the mother, well then the first child feels like they've been abandoned. And the schizophrenics tend to come out of that first 2 year period when some event, whether the mother dies or whether she has another child, that child feels abandoned, and when they feel abandoned, it triggers a whole set of processes. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from his concept of how this all works. He found that if it happens by age 3, then they become potentially a severe depressive down the road. And so he's saying right now they know that these two types of problems have their origin in infancy, and he's developed methodologies as far as helping make corrections on that, but we're not, at this point, not going to get into it. Maybe the next session, depending on how much time we have, we might talk a little bit about the specifics. But next time we will be talking quite a bit more about different methods. I mentioned Janoff already, and the methods that they have used to help people get rid of some of this stuff that's making a problem with their life. And we'll talk about some other concepts that go with it, such as transactional analysis and NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. We've mentioned some of these things before, but you'll probably notice by now as we do these broadcasts, we're kind of keep bringing back other things and tying them all together, because we want you to see that all of this is part of a big picture. It's just not a bunch of pieces that are thrown out there and it's all fragmented, but there is a certain connection. And that's what I like to do, is to show you how we can bring all this together and begin to see the bigger picture, and then it begins to make more sense. Until you have that picture, it's just like a bunch of pieces that are being thrown at you, and then you say, well, why would you use this, or why do this instead of that? It depends. It depends because they all fit at certain points along the way, and they also fit better for certain people than other people. And so you get into personality types, and when we talk about Reich and his character analysis, we're going to we won't go into it in detail, but the idea is that different people, because of the nature of what happened to them, is going to be different. Plus we've got the genetics, the epigenetics, and all these things. Those are all influencing. So it's going to make people different, and some people are going to respond better to certain things than other people will. Now, Mackenzie developed a concept called the unification model for mental illness. And I'm just going to read you a short piece of that, because this explains it very rapidly what his idea is. He says, central to the unification model is the finding of delayed post-traumatic stress disorders from infancy and the two trauma mechanism. Now, two trauma being one at infancy and the second one later than life, that is the precipitator or crystallizer of the problem. In other words, it really brings it to the surface. Everyone understands when a car backfires next to a Vietnam veteran and suddenly he begins speaking Vietnamese, grabs a gun, and hides in the woods for a few days. They understand that. They call that post-traumatic stress or war neuroses. And so it takes a trigger to trigger it, and then the person literally goes back to that period of time and turns on those memories in that part of the brain that took place. And that's why their behavior suddenly is totally different. A loud noise in the present precipitates the flashback to a loud noise in the distant past, and the veteran begins experiencing and behaving as he did at that earlier time. This is thought to occur because during combat the veteran's life was in extreme danger. The mechanism is so obvious that no one has conducted a comparable study to determine if non-combat individuals are affected by loud noises in the same way. What few realize is that more terrifying than war trauma to a soldier is separation from the mother to an infant. For 150 million years of patterning of the mammalian brain, separation from the mother has meant death. Thus, the human infant is quick to misinterpret common events as threats of separation from its mother, and therefore overwhelming threats to its survival. Then, 10, 20, 30 years later, instead of a loud noise precipitating the flashback, it is a similar separation from some other most important person, husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, or group, which precipitates the initial step back in time. The parallel concept, when transposed from the awakening of adult war trauma in the combat veteran to the awakening of infant trauma in the schizophrenic, is more difficult to grasp. Bullets and bombs are readily understood, but moving to a new house or the birth of a sibling, even though potentially overwhelming to the infant, does not seem sufficiently traumatic to set the stage for the later flashback experience. Likewise, combat reality and behavior is easily recognized in the veteran, but infant reality and behavior is not as easily recognized in the adult schizophrenic. It is puzzling why the reality and behavior of the schizophrenic is not more readily recognized as belonging to the infant when one sees a full-grown man sitting in the middle of the floor screaming, "Mommy, Mommy," it seems obvious. The author first observed this as a small child in 1941. An 18-year-old girl running nude through the lawn sprinkler in the front lawn, squealing with delight. It took a quarter of a century to realize that this was perfect normal behavior, but transposed in time. Had she been 18 months old instead of 18 years old, no one would have thought anything odd about her behavior. With careful scrutiny, virtually every piece of bizarre reality and behavior observed in the schizophrenic can be seen to mimic that of an infant, and with careful cumulative observation, correlating age of trauma during infancy with symptoms in the adult schizophrenic, it becomes apparent that the reality and behavior of the schizophrenic matches that of the infant at the time or age that he was traumatized. After such cumulative study, one begins to recognize a peak age and age range of origin for each symptom or disease category, and instead of unreality, one begins to recognize that it is an earlier reality that schizophrenic is experiencing. So the same as the veteran from war trauma goes back mentally and emotionally to the time he was traumatized in the war, the infant was traumatized later in life. A new event triggers and they go back and pick up the same behavior. And he later talks about in this paper the brain. It goes back and brings back up parts of the brain that were in use at that time. And if they continue to do that, he talks about how the brain can atrophy, how the neurotransmitters change. And so instead of, as modern psychiatry is trying to say, it's the chemistry that's off that we have to manipulate, it's not the chemistry that's off that you have to manipulate. The chemistry is off because the body or the mind has gone back and the brain gone back to a different period of time. And so when you can correct that, then you don't have to give the drug, because the drug is actually just, again, a symptom management, but that can lead to other problems. Okay, I see the big hand of Mickey and the little hand of Mickey say that it's time to say adieu again. So we still have a lot to go on all this, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. I hope you're already stimulated to grab the book by Le Boyer and read it, so that by the next time, a lot of this is going to make a lot more sense. And if you want to get the material by Verney, Dr. Thomas Verney, the psychiatrist who did all the studies about the trauma from birth itself, then that would be good reading for the next broadcast. And also you could get Janoff's, or Yanoff, depending on how you want to pronounce it. If you want to get his book on the primal scream, it'll give you some ideas about what he felt about birth trauma and releasing the effects of it out of the body. So, don't forget to tell others about our broadcast. Don't forget to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com. You can click to this broadcast, as you well know, or you can click to the clinic site, Alternative Health and Prevention, and or you can see about things that we're recommending that are very useful to improve your own health and stay healthy. Until next time, be healthy.